called What is Intersectionality? And I suppose in a nutshell, intersectionality is a way of understanding the impact of multiple oppressions and the interactions, the overlap, the connections between the different oppressions that people face. So that's, I've answered the question of what is intersectionality. People will have come across this possibly, maybe you have, maybe you haven't, but people will increasingly come across it in my view, because one of the very welcome things that we're seeing at the moment is an upsurge in interest in questions of oppression, a growing movement, particularly among young women and young other gay and black activists, about trying to challenge really some of the prejudices and the oppressions and the inequalities that we face. And I think it's really in this context that intersectionality is kind of growing, if you like, as a kind of fashion among many people about how to try and understand aspects of oppression and how oppressions crisscross and how they overlap. And so any of you who follow debates online, particularly among feminists, can't really fail to come across some of the arguments going backwards and forwards between often between black and white feminists about intersectionality and what it means. Some of these more serious and some of them kind of a bit of point scoring, which is kind of characteristic of a lot of interactions on social media anyway, but some of the more serious attempts to develop and challenge different ideas around oppression. The idea really comes more strongly, I think, out of academia, and it particularly comes from academia in the States, very much in the same way as privilege theory that we discussed in the meeting before, comes from very similar kind of origins and manifestations, but in Britain it has made its way out of academia and into the wider movement, and even managed to kind of get itself a little bit into the mainstream media. People might have heard some of the debates on Women's Hour, for example, or there have been various features in The Guardian over the last year about this question, and even The Telegraph has decided that it would try and embrace the question of intersectionality with a guest column in January. That's as far as The Telegraph is willing to embrace the concept, I would imagine, but that's where we see it. And it's also something that's been taken up by quite a lot of student activists, people in the colleges. I don't know if people saw last year in Edinburgh, for example, the student union declared itself an intersectional feminist space. So there's, you know, a growing identification of people with the term and with the idea. And I think there's an overlap between this meeting and the meeting before, that for many people intersectionality overlaps with the question of privilege theory. It's partly for some people an explanation about how people can be privileged in some aspects of their identity, but what they would see is disadvantaged by other things. So some privilege theorists have taken up the theory of intersectionality to try and explain some of those kind of contradictions when they're kind of coming up with the different combinations of circumstances, the many different kind of combinations that individual people can exhibit or be part of, or oppressions that they can face or otherwise. But I want to concentrate really not on what we've already discussed, but on trying to go through a little bit about what intersectionality means in more detail, what people mean by who use the term. And, you know, I have to say a note of caution that it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I think we should bear that in mind in the discussion, that, you know, where people are coming from can vary in their usage of it. But I want to go through a little bit about some of the key ideas of intersectionality, of where it's come from, and then spend really the bulk of the meeting trying to evaluate some of those ideas and say where I think they're helpful and where I think they're not so helpful in terms of taking the struggles that we're all committed to, the struggles to eradicate oppressions altogether, how we should evaluate them in terms of that overall aim that I assume most of us are committed to and part of. You see, the ideas of intersectionality really have grown from a critique of feminism by activists and theorists concerned really mostly and originally with the specific position of black women. And the position of black women is still the major focus, I would argue, for most people who talk about intersectionality, both in academia and in the movement more widely. But there has also been an attempt to try and generalise what people have taken from the specific debate around the oppression faced by black women, and to try and generalise it into other ways in which oppression can crisscross, you know, the nature of sexuality oppression, disability oppression, all sorts of other different oppressions and the way in which they crisscross and the way in which they intersect. And really the thing that the idea of intersectionality really brings to the debate is that it's against what it would call, or what some theorists would call, an additive approach to the question of oppression. So say, for example, you are a gay black woman. You can either see that as being a triple burden of being gay and being black and being a woman. You face homophobia, you face racism, and you face sexism. All of that is actually true. Or you can have it or you can think about it in what many intersectionalists would call an intersectional approach, which is that you can't just add all these things together, that what you create at the end of it is more than a sum of its parts. That to be, for example, to be oppressed as a black woman isn't just that you face racism, plus you face sexism, you actually face the oppression that takes on a specific form through the way that they interconnect. Now, this all sounds pie in the sky and very academic and very, you know, out there. What do I actually mean by this? Well, one of the ways to explain what I mean by this is to look at one of the women who was seen as the originators of this theory, a legal scholar from America called Kimberly Crenshaw. And in the late 1980s, Kimberly Crenshaw was really looking at the legal system in America, and particularly at cases of discrimination against different group of workers, about industrial tribunals and discrimination law in America. And she looked at a whole number of different cases. I haven't got time to go into them here, but it is worth reading because it is actually some interesting research that she does that looks at the discrimination laws in America and argues and looks at how they fail to adequately protect black women against discrimination, and actually how employers at various points, you know, try to undermine the legal arguments about why women are being discriminated against by trying to compare them. You know, I can't really go into all of the details, but basically saying that the law fails to adequately protect black women against discrimination in the workplace, and she goes through that in quite a lot of detail. She also looks at things like domestic violence services and other services that are offered to women and how they fail to particularly meet the specific needs of black or migrant women. So all women suffering domestic violence should have access to services that can help them to escape that situation and all the rest of it. But if you're a migrant woman, for example, there may be many reasons why that's harder for you to access than it would be if you have full legal status to be in a country, because drawing attention to yourself is something you may not want to do if, for example, you're an undocumented migrant. It might make it much more difficult. And therefore, she also looked at how certain services fail to address the particular needs that black and migrant women face. So this is a more concrete way of looking at the question of what intersectionality means. And intersectionality didn't really start with Kimberly Crenshaw, the woman I've just been talking about, in the late 1980s. It actually has a much longer history and comes out of a whole strand of thought that has come to be known as black feminism. And probably, you know, every time you go and say, well, this is the origins of this, people can say, well, actually, that comes out of something earlier. That's true, isn't it? Because everything's come from somewhere. No ideas have just emerged in a vacuum. But probably the thing that's normally seen as the founding, or most commonly seen as the founding statement of black feminism, is a statement by a group of American black women known as the Combahee River Collective, which they wrote in 1977, where they talk about why they've chosen to organise separately as black women, and they talk about developing what they call an analysis and practice based on the fact that the major systems of oppression are interlocking. And in actual fact, there are a number of interesting authors who emerged since the Combahee River Collective. I think there are lots of problems with what the Combahee River Collective were both doing and saying, and we can come back to some of those in a minute. But there are very many interesting authors that have emerged in the general tradition that you would call black feminism. People may know some of the names: Angela Davis, Bell Hooks, Patricia Hill Collins. Anybody who knows any of these names will know that these are these are the ones that I've named all American writers, because like privilege theory, this theory originated in America and is much more influential still in North America. And I think it's important to say at this point that in this catch-all phrase of black feminism, it's not true that everybody agrees with each other. You see, sometimes I think there's a false attempt to project a strand of feminism called black feminism, when in actual fact, within that, just because you're black and a woman doesn't mean you're going to have the same political outlook as another person who's black and a woman. And actually, within the so-called grouping that's known as black feminism, there are many different debates and many arguments about strategy and tactics and history and how we understand things. However, what kind of unites this whole kind of loose grouping, if you like, of black feminism is that it developed a critique of the women's movement in America for not taking up questions of racism, and of the anti-racist movements in America for not taking up the specific oppression and position of women. And really these groups argued that feminism had developed around the exclusive concerns of white women, that really a strand of thought that was supposed to represent women and the concerns of women and combating the oppression of women was really based on the exclusive concerns of white women and didn't take into account the questions of the racism that black women faced or why their experiences and their concerns may be different. And they also argued that the anti-racist movement in America was based primarily around the concerns of black men and didn't deal adequately with the question of women. And so they really raised the question about what about the specific forms of oppression that black women face, not just as a double burden, but as the specific situation in which they face. Now, to understand where this is coming from, really, you need to understand a little bit about the context in which these ideas emerged. And we talked about them, for those of you who were in the meeting on privilege theory, we talked we did talk about the rise and fall of the social movements in America. It's a very big topic, and it was very interesting to have somebody in the meeting who had been involved in the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the anti-war movement, the women's movement, and so on, at their height in America, who spoke, for those who weren't there, and was very interesting about the expressing the great hope that those movements felt when they were on the rise, but also the fragmentation and the disappointment and the frustration as those movements fell. And it is true to say that activists did face a lot of sexism in the social movements in America, particularly in the student movement, but also within the Black liberation movement. And if people want to discuss why that might be, we can come back to that in the discussion. And that was partly the impetus for setting up of a separate women's movement at all, which actually came relatively quite late compared to the other movements in America. However, it's not true to say that the American women's movement as a whole didn't take up the question of racism. Actually, many of the leading activists in the women's movement in America came to politics from the civil rights movement. They came from a background in fighting segregation and fighting racism in America to move on to some of the questions that concern them around fighting for women's liberation. And the women's movement in America, initially at least, did take up a whole number of key issues. They took up issues around the state persecution of the Black Panthers, for example, although sometimes these activities did cause arguments and splits in the women's movement about what their concerns should be. However, it is true that the black feminists did have some justification for their criticisms, because as the movements declined, not at their height, as they were growing, they expressed people's concerns with changing the whole world. As movements do when they're rising, the upsurge of any movement tends to bring with it a feeling of unity, a feeling of us fighting together, a feeling of us trying to change things. But as things go down and they fragment, it is true that the women's movement, for example, came to rest on a narrower and narrower base, coincidingly with a narrower and narrower focus, retreating from the radical confrontation, from the demand for true liberation for everybody, and retreating much more to the concerns of middle-class women, mostly white middle-class women, seeking equality with other men of their own class. So it was true that there was some criticisms that could be had of where the women's movement was at this time. And some of the critique of the women's movement is true in a slightly different way, because it's not just the black feminists. Marxists also question the idea of a real, genuine sisterhood. You know, and Audre Lorde, the black activist poet, puts it like this. She says, by and large within the women's movement, white women today, she was writing in a particular context that I've described, white women focus upon their oppression as women and ignore differences of race, sexual preference, class and age. There is a pretense to homogeneity, that's a hard word to say, isn't it, of experience, covered by the word sisterhood, that does not in fact exist. Now she meant something slightly different to what Marxists mean by this, but I think there is a point to this critique, that actually for Marxists we also agree that there's no essential sisterhood, that there's no essential woman, if you like, and there's also we don't also see all women as having either the same experience or as having the same interests. In particular, you think about the questions of class and the things that divide ruling class women from the experiences of the vast majority of women. The ruling class women who, you know, are able to sit on the top boardrooms or to sit, you know, Angela Merkel's the Chancellor of the most powerful country in Europe, has an absolute different interest to the vast majority of women across Europe who are facing low pay, a lack of childcare, cuts to public services, increased burden on their family. We don't see a sisterhood either. And just before I move on, really, I think it's also worth remembering that what I've talked about just now is the specific context of the women's movement in America. And actually, the women's movement in Britain, it's worth remembering, developed in a different context. In the earlier session that I talked about, the woman who'd been part of the movement in America pointed out that there had been a break in the tradition of the radical left in America with McCarthyism. So when the movements in America grew up in the 70s, they didn't have access to kind of Marxist left-wing, even in the general sense, the sort of left-wing Marxist ideas that actually were central to the movements in Britain. And in Britain, the movements against oppression that developed in the late 60s and early 70s were developed in a different context, one with a much stronger radical left and one with a higher level actually of general class struggle. And those movements had a very different character and much more imbued with a link between specific oppressions and the question of class. People may want to come back to this in the discussion, but I think it's quite important because I think it explains both why these sorts of ideas that I'm talking about that actually play down the question of class, and I'll come back to this in a minute, originate particularly from a context in America, but I think it's also a reminder for us of a more general point that ideas don't emerge in a vacuum. Ideas emerge out of a particular context, and they come in particular out of the natures of struggles and the real attempts of people to try and change the society in which they live. So having sketched a bit about the genesis of where the ideas of intersectionality and its roots in black feminism come from, I want to really spend the rest of the meeting evaluating what I think Marxists should try and make of this kind of, these ideas and this sort of framework for understanding the world. And I want to start with the positives, because some of this critique is obviously correct. It doesn't seem particularly profound, it probably seems fairly obvious to us, but it is true that not all women are white, not all women are middle class, not all women are heterosexual, etc., etc. And it's not just the case that we see a variety of women in this way, and we see them massively divided by class, and I'll come on at the end to talk about why the division in class around class is different to these other divisions and the other questions of oppression that we've talked about. But it's also the case that if you look at the history, not just of feminism, but of other forms of oppression, it is true that sometimes because of the focus on oppression as a woman or oppression as a gay person, sometimes these particular versions of oppression can not just exclude other people's experiences, but have been used at different points to actually attack other people who are oppressed. You think, for example, of the question of Islamophobia, and it is true that in France, for example, the feminist movement, the mainstream feminist movement, has been used to attack the right of Muslims to wear the veil in France. That they've seen, you know, there's been an argument from some French feminists in the mainstream French feminism that it's, you know, it's anti-woman to wear the veil and all the rest of it. Something that we fought very hard against in Britain, where we have a different tradition, where socialists have dominated the debate to say that we absolutely stand for the right of women to choose what they wear, and we're absolutely opposed to racism and the racism that goes with Islamophobia. But actually, in this country as well, there's been an attempt to use, I think somebody talked about this in an earlier session, to use the demand for gay liberation, again, to try and stoke up Islamophobia. So there are, and sometimes people fall for this, so sometimes it can be that one form of oppression doesn't necessarily lead people to identify or solidarity with other people who are also facing oppression. Where can intersectionality be useful? It can also be useful in some of the things I talked about at the beginning. For questions of social policy, what we should demand. You know, if you work with migrant women, you should be able to demand services that suit those women, or be able to deal with the specific issues around disability that many people face in accessing services, around all sorts of different questions. So in social policy, it can be a useful thing. I don't think it has to be called intersectionality. I think many people who are concerned with these things have thought about these things previously, but it can be a useful thing to do. I think it's also true that there can be interesting writings that have emerged from this sort of general tradition of looking at the world. I think particularly if you look at some of the questions around gender under slavery, the questions of sexuality and racism. I think if you read somebody like Angela Davis on sexuality and the creation of a myth of the black rapist, I think these are all very interesting things that help us to understand the particular manifestations of oppression and how racism operates and all the rest of it. I don't know if people here, how many of you have seen the fantastic film 12 Years a Slave, but I think 12 Years a Slave, in many ways, some people might call it embracing an intersectional approach, and personally I don't think you need to, but it does show you some of the interactions between the questions of class oppression, class and racism and gender oppression, the way in which the kind of the sexual violence against women slaves is used, the interactions between the women slave owners and the women slaves themselves. It deals with a whole number of these complicated relationships and complex relationships that are part and parcel of the domination and the creation of slavery. These are interesting things, and there are interesting things to be read that I think can help us to understand how both racism and sexism and other forms of oppression work. But you see, I think there are also some serious limitations to this approach, and that's really what I want to go through now. Because first thing, a lot of this is not unique to what is called an intersectional approach. As I said earlier, I think socialists and many others have been aware and have theorised many of these points before all of this and before it became fashionable to talk about intersectionality. Take, for example, the general racism faced by Asian people in Britain and by Muslims now in particular. How does Islamophobia work in terms of stereotypes? It works through, I would say, the dual stereotype, both of the Muslim male, the bearded terrorist. All Muslim men now seem to be characterised as potential terrorists, some women as well, but still mostly men. But it also operates through a stereotype of the passive, victimised Muslim woman who is somehow a victim. Now, socialists have argued against both of these stereotypes and understood both of these stereotypes. These have both been central to the work that we've done, particularly in the Stop the War movement, but in other struggles against Islamophobia, where we've understood that both of these things are myths and lies that should be challenged. And you think particularly about the role that Muslim women played in leading the anti-war movement and in the struggles against the oppressions of the Palestinians that are absolutely at the forefront of our minds at the moment. We've shown both in practice and theory why we're opposed to these sorts of stereotypes. But you see, I think there are deeper problems with intersectionality, other than just quibbling about who thought some of these ideas first. You see, I think the problem with intersectionality, not just as a source of interesting observations on the world, but as something that people see as a form of politics that can guide us to action, as a guide to actually changing the world and not just commenting on it, really falls into some of the same dangers that we were talking about earlier, about the problems with the politics that is based primarily on the question of identity, and particularly on the question of individual identity. Now, that's not to say that identity is irrelevant, or that it can't provoke huge and powerful movements. You think, for example, of the Black Power movement in America. Nobody's going to say that that was a waste of time or a marginal movement. It was based around a question of identity, the question of black power. And when it said that black is beautiful, when it changed how people felt, not just about the world and about their oppressors, but how they felt about themselves, this was a very important thing. Again, when you think about the gay liberation movement, at its height, it shook the political establishment, and it also changed the lives of very many gay people. Rising movements, even around identity or whatever motivates them, can make a huge impact. However, it's also the case, and we know this from the history of what happened to those movements in the 60s and 70s, that all politics of identity are prone to fragmentation, particularly as the struggles then decline. Just look at the question of the women's movement. It divided not just into black women criticising white women in the way that I've talked about, but actually split over questions of sexuality, over questions of lifestyle, over questions of all sorts of other divisions that people then found. The Combahee River Collective that I talked about earlier is an example of this. They tried to unite black women in trying to raise specific concerns about where the feminist movement was going, and they themselves suffered a split over the question of sexuality. And this is because I think when you base your mode of operating over the question of identity and your movement is declining, it becomes not just about understanding and respecting differences, it can also become about the question of who is your actual enemy, and about the questions, it can become very inward-looking to the questions of personal behaviour and personal morality, which is certainly what happened with the movements when they declined and fragmented. You see, once you say not all women are the same, and not all women are white, you also have to say not all black women are the same, not all black women are straight, or not all straight black women are able-bodied, and so on. And so ironically, a politics that for many today can feel that it's about inclusion, that it's about saying within a wider movement, we want to think about the experiences of black women, or working class women, or other groups of women who may be excluded in the eyes of some people from the mainstream of some strands of politics, such as feminism, can actually become about increased division, and sometimes can become about increased moralism. And actually you do see this in some of the kind of vitriolic and blogging that takes place when the activity is reduced to the level of individual attitudes and arguing with each other as individuals. It's also true that this framework of understanding things ignores many questions of politics. You know, I talked earlier about not all black women are going to have the same point of view. And, you know, it's not just myself, there are other activists, Marxists and Socialists, who have a problem with dividing the questions of thought into people's identity. So there's something called a black feminism, a lesbian feminism, etc. Instead of saying there are political differences, there are different political ways of understanding the world, and we should talk about what the politics are that inform those. And you see, I think intersectionality in many ways reflects a theory that was inherited from the post-Marxists and the post-modernists that say that experience and subjectivity are the most important way of us understanding or acting on the world. Now, subjectivity is important. Our life experiences are normally what motivate us to try and change things. Not always. Sometimes we see the horrors of what's happening in Palestine, we have no connection with it, but we feel moved to think about how we can challenge such great injustices. But for many people, their own experience of racism, of women's oppression, all the rest of it, is something that motivates them. How we feel matters, and it matters to Marxists. Whether or not people feel that they are part of the working class is not the defining question of class, but it does matter. It is helpful if people feel that they're part of a wider working class, because it makes class struggle more effective, and it makes people feel that they're part of that kind of collective. But taken to its logical extreme as the basis for understanding and motivating political activity, you can get to a situation where it's not possible to challenge somebody's subjective experience. And this is where I'm not saying that this is the prevalent position in the movement today, but it certainly has been at certain times in the movements against oppression, and it certainly can be, I think there are dangers of it, that people say that only black people have something to say about racism, only women can say something about the fight over women's oppression. And I think this is quite a dangerous route to go down, because actually, I think to understand any of those issues, whether it's racism or sexism, or actually the combination of racism and sexism faced by black women, you have to be able to have a much wider view of how society operates. It comes back to the thing that we were talking about in previous sessions, about not just understanding individuals' experience, but understanding how that fits into a much bigger systemic oppressions, the massive big systemic inequalities that create racism and create sexism, and how they are anchored in a capitalist society. You see, intersectionality really, I think, describes the problem, and that's not really enough. I think we have to go beyond just understanding that there are many different oppressions, and that some of these oppressions overlap, and some people face more oppressions than others. A very stark reality if you're one of the people facing those many oppressions. But we also have to go beyond seeing every oppression as a combination of different crisscrossing oppressions and individual experiences as part of a totality of how society works as a whole, and in whose interests oppression and societal works as a whole. And Marx has a method for doing this. You forgive me if I move into the world of the Marxist method for a moment, but Marx explains that you have to move from the specifics, in other words from the description or the experience, to what he calls the simplest determinants, to break down the experience or the specific manifestation of oppression, to break it down to find out what is the source of that, what is the key thing behind it all, what are the simplest determinants, to move from what you can see, what you can feel, what's tangible, to thinking what is behind this. And then to move from that, not to just leave it at that general level. We understand, for example, that racism is caused by the divide and rule. It has its roots in slavery, it serves the benefit of the capitalist class, it's used to divide and rule workers, it's used to scapegoat migrants in the current climate. But we have to move from the general understanding back to the specifics. So we have to understand both where it comes from, what are the root causes of these oppressions, not just describe them, but what causes them, how do we understand them as part of a bigger picture of how society operates, and then we have to be able to return to the question of what does that mean in terms of what we do about them. And you see, I think intersectionality as a tool for actual resistance, rather than just for critiquing different movements, falls down most strongly on the question of class. Because many of those who use the intersectional approach do include class in their series of ways in which people can be oppressed. And they do acknowledge that class can be important. And I think for many people, that can be a step forward for people who are fighting oppression. I think certainly in terms of feminism, that can be a step forward. But actually, for Marxists, I think sometimes it can be a step backwards to see things in this way, that class is just seen as one of a variety of different oppressions and different inequalities that people face. And actually, this is the kind of dominant view of how oppression and class work in society, that sees class as one of a series of divisions and inequalities that crisscross right across society, the matrix of domination, as Patricia Hill Collins calls it, or, you know, I think there are various commentators who call it the holy trinity of race, gender and class. There are many people who have added many more forms of oppression, rightly, that we should be thinking about to the questions just of race, gender and class, but it's just seen as one of a variety of different forms of oppression. And I think for Marxists, because we understand both the destructive and outrageous nature and the reality of oppressions, that it is, you know, facing racism, sexism, homophobia are all things that we absolutely want to challenge and we absolutely want to be part of. But we see class as something different to all of the other forms of inequality and divisions in society. And it should be clear from meetings that we've had already in this course and from other things that people have been to, that this isn't about saying that class is one of a variety of crisscrossing ones, but it just happens to be the most important ones. For Marxists, class is different to the other forms of oppression, because the other forms of oppression are rooted in class society. They emerge in different ways, and we can talk about the different ways, if you like, out of class society itself, and they are bolstered by class society. Which means, for us, we have to get to the root of what is it that sustains all those different divisions, and that is exploitation on the basis of class. And the thing that keeps capitalism going as a system is the ability of a small minority of people at the top of society, the ruling class, to exploit the vast majority of people in the world, the working class of the world. And for us, therefore, class isn't based on identity or on experience or on how people feel about themselves. It's based on an objective process of how capitalism renews itself, develops itself, sustains itself, the huge drive for profit that pushes the society forward. But at the same time as capitalism develops in that way, it creates, inevitably, what Marx calls the grave diggers of capitalism. It creates a huge group of people in society, the working class, who have both an interest and the power to overthrow the system as a whole. Now, we talked earlier, that doesn't mean that that's automatic, that struggle is automatic, that in a society that is based on this huge class conflict, with all the other divisions that flow from that, struggles will erupt and they will continue to erupt, and we've seen that time and time again. But and those struggles can change the way that people feel, they can challenge oppression, they can challenge, you know, the heights of struggles. We saw some of this at the opening rally, didn't we, the other day, of what it change for the women who are on that platform, and the strikers from Lambeth, how they felt growing in terms of their confidence, their ability to speak out, and all the rest of it. Struggle changes people, but struggle by itself isn't enough to eliminate racism and sexism and all the rest of it. We also have to have a political fight against the things that divide our class, because our class, the working class, is made up of all of these intersecting oppressions. It's made up of black and white and women and men and gay and straight, disabled and able-bodied, transgendered people, and everybody is part, all working class people are part of that great class. And that's why Marx called the working class the universal class, not because everybody in that class is the same, but because everybody in that class has the same interest in change. And that change is not just an interest in the glorious class struggle and in the economic change and getting rid of capitalism. That is a struggle to uproot the forms of oppression that all of us face in many different manifestations, and to say we have one struggle and we don't need millions of separate struggles, but we need a massive struggle in order to change the society for good.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Esme for her introduction. I have pretty broad agreement with what she said. I attended a meeting in Oxford recently where Jennifer Saul spoke. She is a prominent philosopher who's at the moment residing in Britain, and she was giving a number of examples of how people who were victims of oppression, perhaps victims is the wrong word, but anyway, were dealt with in job interviews. And there were examples, it took about half an hour to show these examples of how women were dealt with in job interviews, black people, disabled people, etc., etc. She had a name for the process of what was happening, which I've forgotten now, but it will probably become prominent because she herself is very prominent. And I asked her in the discussion why she didn't have any examples of discrimination against working class people. And she answered that that's probably because I'm American. And that answer sort of passed muster in the meeting, but it's actually a very inadequate answer because, as Esme has pointed out, the most serious oppression that all of us suffer from is the oppression that we suffer under the system of capitalism. And the people of America suffer from that oppression just as much as people in other parts of the world. So I'm concerned about, along the lines of points that Esme made, that there is a kind of divisive or vociferous tendency within this kind of identity politics, where oppressions are seen as the vital part, specific oppressions that are not to do with being working class, are seen as the vital part of people's identities, and the fact that they're part of the working class is not seen as a vital part of their identity. So I agree with Esme that we have to conduct a political struggle to see the specific oppressions as being allied to and rooted in the system of capitalism. One article that I found useful recently is by a woman called Joanna Brenner, who I think is American. It's quite difficult to track down because it's in an American book. But there are people who are trying to be respectful to the particular oppressions that particular people suffer from.
Please.
Yeah, I'm just finishing. But at the same time, to show how these specific oppressions are linked to the overall system of capitalism in a way that Karl Marx would have understood that system as operating.
Hi, I'm Caroline from Manchester. I wanted to bring up about how intersectionality works within the trade union movement. and about some issues that I've come across recently, especially at the Unison conference last month. In Unison they have self-organised groups, which I know isn't a feature of all of the trade unions, but we have groups for disabled workers, black workers, women workers, and there was an issue that came up where the disability self-organised group had asked that a disability officer be asked to the list of branch officials for each branch, and that was opposed by the LGBT group and the women's group, who were saying, well, if you do that, then are you going to let a black person, are you going to need to have a black person for the black members group, or can you then have a white person, or would you be able to have a non-LGBT person representing LGBT within branches, which isn't actually what was being asked. It was if there is no disabled officer within the branch, can you please allow a non-disabled officer to help disabled members of the branch? And I think it was difficult for a lot of the delegates to know how to answer on that question, because we have got the tradition of self-organisation, and I think we wouldn't have gone down that line to set up self-organisation in the way that it is within the union. But to then try and respect that those groups are there, I think it'd be really difficult to actually break that structure down, because it is really deep-rooted. But it was quite a difficult question to answer, because the self-organised groups were against having a disability officer who may be able to help members within branches if that person isn't disabled themselves.
Yes, the speaker did mention connections between Islamophobia, for example, and homophobia. And a particular example I want to mention here is the recent news about the Ofsted inspections in Birmingham, and the way they were carried out, and this whole Trojan horse business, and the fact that Ofsted inspectors would go into a primary school asking a Muslim child, are they Islamophobic? Are they homophobic? And how intimidating can that be? The kid might not even know what homophobia means, I think. And obviously that is Islamophobic. And also, I'm old enough to remember when Section 28 was introduced by the Thatcher government in the 1980s. That, for those who don't remember it, that was a law a bit like what's been introduced in Russia more recently, where the promotion of homosexuality in schools was outlawed. And when that happened, you got TV interviews with interviewing Muslim parents who didn't want their children to learn about homosexuality because it was un-Islamic. That tells me two things. First of all, how hypocritical our ruling class are, playing one oppressed group off against another and then reversing themselves one generation later. And it also tells me that with the intersectional approach, that it doesn't help at all in resolving these issues, whereas our approach, which is based on ultimately what benefits always damaging to the working class and build our tactics from that, can be a way forward. So we worked with Muslim groups in the Stop the War movement 10 years ago, and built up some links. And where I live in Bristol, a few years after that, we had an issue where in a primary school where some Muslim parents were complaining about the positive images for homosexuality that was being introduced into a primary school. And I'm not saying the whole thing ended happily and was all resolved neatly and tidily. It was extremely messy and unpleasant. But it was a lot less unpleasant because we had built up links through our work in the Stop the War movement, and at least that showed us a pointer to how these things can be resolved.
I'm from Germany. The intersectionality debate is filtering through to Germany, and maybe there's a special academic example I have how it is dealt with. This question is Gabriele Winker. She is the most important person to promote this idea of intersectionality, and is talking about change of paradigm, this idea of intersectionality. And the interesting thing, on page 3 or 4, she is talking about all these dimensions and levels and categories and oppression-generating dimensions and so on. And then she's talking about how many categories we might find which are oppressions. And she says there are people, they would propose about 13 categories, oppression categories, but that's a bit difficult to handle, so I will just take on 4 or 5. So it's quite randomly what sort of category I want to take into my concept. And one is classism. She's talking about classism, understands this as a sort of discrimination in the labor market. Classism is people who had not have enough access to education, so to get a better paid job. This is classism. Then ageism, bodyism, sexism, and I think a 5th category. And because racism, under racism, there's an attack of feminists from a different strand of feminism who are saying, yeah, but you are not talking, when you are talking about racism, you are not talking about Islamophobia. And Islamophobia is a question of Islamic women in Germany. So this is completely not there. So what you say, what you do, how you conceive oppression is also a highly political question. How you see the society at the levels where oppression really exists, where campaigns of oppression are, and so on. So in the end, Gabriele Winker is talking about, yes, now we see all these interlocking oppressions, but we haven't found a way now how to fight all this. And I have no idea. We should discuss further. I have no idea. And I think this is exactly the moment where she is not prepared to go into the question of class struggle, of the history of class struggle, where all these interlocking questions have already been tackled, where we have so many examples how to fight against racism and exploitation and sexism and so on.
I haven't seen anyone indicate from the back, so I can't see very well down there, so just wave your hand really high.
Yeah, I want to respond to the first speaker, who, well, one of the first actually, who said that he had asked about class as also an oppression, and had gotten an answer that that wasn't happening in America, or kind of strange answer. But I think actually that class is not an oppression. I mean, you have different sort of oppressions, but you also have exploitation, and these things, they feed into each other. Let's see, the economic system, of course, generates a lot of ideas surrounding racism, sexism, etc. But this does not immediately give oppressed people the chance to do anything about it. They are aware of their oppression, but it's also in a way interlinked to the economic system. So yeah, I find it kind of hard to explain. Maybe someone after me can do a little bit more of explaining. But I do know that they're interlinked, but they're not the same. For instance, well, I can be, as a worker, oppressed as a woman, but that does not mean that that oppression gives me a base of power. If I'm aware of it, then yeah, what can I do with it? It's like the former speaker who was talking about categories. Okay, now we've all defined it. We all got little corners of people who are, which is also not possible, because everybody in this room probably has an own way, or yeah, is an own part of an embodiment of oppressions or exploitations, different jobs, different backgrounds, etc. So I guess this brings me back to Marx, who actually
actually kind of in a way also was an intersectionalist when he said, well, people are not abstractions, they're organic creatures who actually embody oppressions and exploitations in a different way, and they react towards each other and they move in a certain way. And I think you can also see that in the debate between, for instance, Femin and Muslim women, and it's actually about what is feminism, what is the rights over your own body, etc. And well, leave it at that.
Yeah, I just wanted to really raise some issues around the social model of disability and intersectionality. Because debates around intersectionality haven't really permeated the UK disabled people's rights movement in like quite the same way as it has in North America and Canada, for example. There is a kind of understanding coming through of intersectionality basically just as something that's a new way of describing, if you like, multiple forms of oppression, which is something that we've talked about for a long time. But what hasn't happened among disabled activists is really that kind of debate around class being nothing more than one in a number of overlapping forms of oppression. And that's for a number of reasons. I think partly because disabled people in the UK are currently engaged in a ferocious class struggle against millionaire eating boys who are taking away our benefits. But even preceding this government, there's this intrinsic relationship between disability and poverty. Disability gives rise to poverty, poverty gives rise to disability. So an awareness of class politics has always kind of been within disabled people's rights movement. The social model recognises that we're not disabled by our impairments. What we're disabled by are the barriers that capitalist society creates in order to exclude disabled people from the workforce, thereby maximising productivity and profit. And who benefits from the oppression of disabled people? It's not non-disabled people, because non-disabled people are affected by our oppression as our family members and as our friends, and non-disabled people can become disabled themselves at any time. What we're facing as disabled activists in the UK, though, is an idea that's being desperately promulgated by sections of the disability sector who've been co-opted by government. And what they're telling us at the moment is that whereas disabled activists are fighting against welfare reform and the dismantling of the welfare state, they're telling us that what we should be doing, they're saying that it's not a question of material resources, it's a question of attitudes, and telling us that that's where we should be starting, that's what we should be focusing our efforts on. But what I've seen over the last couple of years, actually, is that in the active struggle alongside trade unionists and community activists, there's been a greater change in levels of attitude towards disabled people than in all the years of disability equality training sessions and policy writing put together. Disabled people are sick of sitting in meeting rooms discussing what an inclusive society might actually look like. What we need to do is to unite and build the revolutionary change that can actually make that happen.
One of the previous speakers was talking about oppression and exploitation. I find it much easier to think in concrete terms and genuine historical experience rather than thinking in more abstract forms. So I'm going to give an example here to see how there could be a relationship between oppression and exploitation. And one of that, to me, one of the most important things, very influential in terms of my political development in the 60s, was the whole thing around the bus boycott in Montgomery. Because really, when you look at the situation there with Rosie Parks, you're looking essentially at a black working class woman. And we see how, out of that movement, we see how oppression and exploitation are very closely related. For those of you who don't know about the boycott, one of the interesting things about it, well, the key thing about it, was when they both boycotted the buses, a lot of the women workers in Montgomery, their work was to work for middle-class white women. They had to basically wash their clothes, clean their houses, and look after their kids. Now, the thing about the bus boycott was that actually that couldn't happen. So what happened was that the middle-class women were essentially breaking the kind of sort of the supremacist white solidarity, if you like, by going up and picking up black women to come and clean their houses. What it meant was that the bus company lost a lot of revenue and had to actually capitulate. Now, from that situation, you saw a working class action that actually transformed the civil rights movement. And that process, if you look at the process of the civil rights movement, which is a fight against black oppression, but actually carried out through class struggle, then you can see how the movements can really begin to evolve and develop. And when you look at the development of the black movement, you've also got to factor in that this had a massive impact on, for instance, one of the most important figures around at the time was a guy called James Baldwin, who was a black activist, a very important political figure and cultural figure in terms of black civil rights, but was also, importantly, was also gay. And he brought that factor of his experience as a gay black man in America at that time and absolutely opened up possibilities that start to develop. So actually, class struggle actually develops ideas about what oppression is, how to fight oppression, and there is a kind of continual development and interaction, and a process starts to take place. And I think Esme is absolutely right. When there's an upturn, you see the links between class and oppression. When there's a downturn, the ideas become much more idealistic and abstract, and you're just looking for the differences and not what unifies us.
Yeah, Esme points to some of the strengths of the theory and to some of the weaknesses. I think where some of the weaknesses might become most clear is where you have sections of working class people in conflict with each other who both face oppression. If you saw recently, there was a racist attack in Tottenham, which was the result of a conflict between Eastern Europeans and local black communities who are in conflict with each other. If intersectionality reduces this problem to the solving of this problem to the creation of a matrix in which we work out who suffers the most oppression, and then from that basis, how should we proceed? I think we go absolutely nowhere. What we're essentially doing is driving people down to essential categories that are derived from where they've come from in the world and what colour skin they've got. And if there are two things that Marxists are absolutely against, it's reducing the people precisely to that sort of categorisation. The great beauty of a class analysis is that it enables us to try and pitch a propaganda that will appeal to both groups and to point out what they've got in common and what fighting each other does to aid the process of exploitation and ripping us all off. Now, I'm not saying that's easy. It can be extremely difficult. Not only difficult because to go into a conflict situation like that with a leaflet isn't easy. Of course it's not easy. But it's not easy also because sometimes you have to challenge ideas about people that they think are part of their identity. It is quite common to come across people from Eastern Europe who believe that they're in some form of white supremacy and believe that that is part of their cultural identity. But of course, that's something we feel we absolutely have to challenge. It's also true that you can come across people who are second or third generation black in this country who regard the new wave of immigrants as a threat to their own position and people who are driving down wages. You have to challenge that idea. I'm not arguing that putting a class solution is the easy solution. Sometimes it's the more difficult thing to do. But as Marxists, we know it's the only effective tool that we actually have.
The next contributor will be our last one, and then we'll go back to Esme.
One of the things that Marx said is that the truth is concrete. He encouraged us always to think about what is the material reality, what is the actual material reality of what is going on for people. And somebody here earlier talked about human beings as organic creatures who embody oppression. And when we embody oppression, we also internalise that oppression sometimes. But for people who are driving through the Marxism that we're identified with, classical Marxism, we're not holding as equal and separate the economic, the political, and the ideological. That's an Althusserian approach to Marxism. The classical Marxist approach understands that the economic situation in a society is fundamentally determinant of people's social relations with one another. How we are organised economically is extremely instrumental in how we relate to one another as social beings. So if you accept that premise, then it's possible to understand that the way in which we think about ourselves, our identity, which at the end of the day is made up of the way in which we think, it's made up of the words that are inside of our head. Where do those words come from? They're coming from the ideological strata of the society, which is coming out of the economic base. It's coming out of the social relations that we're organised within. Now, an example of it would be the word Islamophobia. It's a new word. It hasn't always existed because the fear of Islam, in the way it's constructed in our world at the moment, has not always existed. It has been mediated through the way in which we're organised economically, which moves through the political environment and into the ideological environment. And it's on that basis that as Marxists we say we have to grapple with the economic reality of our lives. Because that is the fundamental engine. It's not determinate in a stupid way. That's why we've got the word dialectic. That's why we go back and forth between understanding the way we're organised economically and what that makes us do inside of our own minds. And how, when we start to think about something, we can move that back into the economic base. So when we realise that we're being oppressed, we can start to organise at the economic level.
I just hand you over to Esme to sum up.
It's quite interesting, there's going to be a crisis and a recovery at 2 o'clock tomorrow, so it's quite a lot to fit in. Thank you to everybody who spoke in the discussion. It's very interesting because sometimes meetings about something like intersectionality can feel very kind of airy-fairy. Some flies attacking me then, just as I said that. Can seem very airy-fairy, a bit abstract, a bit hard to pin down. So I think the comrades who come and grapple with specific examples, I think have been very useful of drawing out really what the implications of the argument are. Because I think at the crux of the issue really is what I think somebody said in the discussion, that how you understand and how you see society is a very political question, because it informs then how you see the best way of changing and transforming that society. And really when it comes down to it, intersectionality at its base really is about seeing society as divided into this crisscrossing of different sorts of inequalities that cross over each other. For Marxists, we see things in a different way. We see, yes, that all these different forms of inequality do exist, but that we see them within the context of a society that is fundamentally divided around the question of class. And so the person who said that class is not an oppression, it's about exploitation, is absolutely right. I mean, I think working class people do face a form of oppression, a form of prejudice about accents and all the rest of it. But this is not the most important thing about class. Class is different to all other forms of oppression because it is the fundamental division in society that determines how the society both exists, how it perpetuates, how it moves forwards, the massive drive to profit. Now the massive drive to profit that shapes capitalism actually has an impact then on all the other forms of oppression that exist. You take the question, for example, of women's oppression. When there is an economic crisis and there is austerity and there are huge cuts, Ellen spoke actually about how some of this affects disabled activists and the oppression of disabled people. It also has an impact on women. In terms of the cuts to the welfare state, impact both in terms of job losses of women who tend to work in the public sector, but also in terms of the extra burden that is then thrown both in childcare and in terms of care for the sick and the elderly relatives onto the family. And the people who are under capitalism, due to the way that capitalism has created the ideology around the family, that means that burden is thrown increasingly onto the question of women. So actually, these questions are related. It's not that they're not related, but for us the key question is, how do we unlock this? If we all agree that all of these oppressions exist and that they're all wrong, what we don't want is just to describe them or to argue among ourselves about which ones are more important and who's more oppressed and what combination of oppression is the worst. And we don't want to just describe how bad things are. We want to take apart this system that has created this all these different crisscrossing oppressions and has created a system that is so ruthlessly driven for profit and not for human need or human existence. And that really means I think, thinking about why class struggle and why a strategy based on working class struggle is so important. And that's not to say that other struggles are not more important. Struggles take all sorts of different forms. The big struggles against racism, against fascism, are part of the struggles of the working class. The struggles to drive back fascism, you think about the 1970s, what really changed the political climate in Britain was a mass movement against fascism in Britain that drove back the organised fascists, but also transformed the atmosphere politically in Britain over a whole number of questions around racism and around, you know, you can talk to people growing up in Britain at that time about what a difference it made. That movement would never have been as effective as it was if it had been based on the idea that black people are the only people who understand or can challenge racism, or Asian people are the only people who can understand or challenge racism. Obviously, if you're black or Asian, you understand the impact of racism 1,000 times more than if you've never been a victim of it. But we absolutely reject the idea that white people can't be part of the struggle against racism or against fascism, because people can be, they have been, and they have to be if these things are going to be effective. And this brings me really to a couple of final points. Somebody talked at the beginning about self-organised groups in the trade unions. Now, as Marxists and Socialists, we've always defended the right of people who are oppressed to organise themselves as oppressed people separately, if that's what they feel that they want to do. We've always in the unions defended the right to have black sections or women's sections or disabled sections, and we continue to do so. But that doesn't mean that we think it's the best way necessarily of organising. And actually the sort of united struggles that bring together black, white, men and women and all the rest of it are important, not just because they break down those divides, but because they're the most effective ways of winning change. You think about how women won some of the basic legal rights that we have in Britain, the rights to free abortion and the rights to equal pay, something that we're still fighting for today. But how did we win at least the principle of those things in law? We won them through a big struggle that involved not just women, but women and men and the trade unions in Britain taking to the streets and being part of that. So we actually believe that organising on a class basis is very important. And to do that, you have to have the ability to argue politics, because you have to, as people have pointed out, be able to explain to people why it's in their class interests to break down some of the divisions and the prejudices that people see. You see, it's not surprising to me that in a new movement that's kind of emerging around a whole number of questions of inequality and oppression, that people don't automatically think that class and class struggle and class politics and socialist politics are necessarily the starting point or come immediately to the conclusions that this is the best way to organise. It's not surprising, is it? The idea of class being a central divide in society is obscured, I would say, in a couple of ways. Firstly, what is class, I think, is massively obscured and mystified by the media, by education, by the commentators, who really just see class as about, do you have a northern accent, or do you eat mushy peas, or, you know, and there are loads of surveys. The BBC ran a massive survey a couple of years ago about this, where they said that basically they put across this whole idea that you were working class if you ate peas off a knife or something, which is quite a talent, I would say, peas off a knife. But that reduced class to such superficial ideas about how you talk or where you dress or what you eat or all the rest of it. That's not what we mean by class. By class we mean all of the people who are forced to sell their labour power, or depend on people who sell their labour power in order to work. Class is a massive thing. And class is also obscured because actually, while we've had a resurgence of an anti-capitalist movement, we haven't seen class struggle rising to that level. We see glimpses of it, and we saw on Thursday with the mass public sector strike, and we saw the same thing in 2011, brief glimpses of what our class looks like when it's powerful, when it's striking, when it's on the street, and you see how excited and brilliant and multiracial and multi-gendered, and how what a brilliant mood and atmosphere that brings. But actually, the number of disputes, the level of class struggle, the level at which people feel they are part of the class struggle to change society isn't enough, it isn't strong enough. And as it gets stronger, it can pull behind it other forms and strengthen other forms of resistance. And my very final point, really, is that we should remember in all these discussions about oppression that oppressed people, the same as working class people, who are often the same people, are not just victims in the whole story that we're talking about. And while people were talking about some of this, I was thinking about some of the stories about black women and Asian women. We talked a lot about America, but I was thinking a little bit about Britain. And I think one of the best examples of where struggles against class struggles fused with questions of oppression is probably the story of the Glamwick strikers in the 1970s in Britain, where a tiny Asian woman, Jobeen Desai, led a struggle of predominantly Asian workers that became actually a struggle that changed the course, I would say, of working class history and the nature of the trade union movement in Britain. And a small group of Asian women, led by one of the most resilient and fiery characters that you will meet in British history, led a strike that then led to mass picketing of many people who came from trade union movements all over Britain, many of them white workers, many of them people who actually came from remote parts of Britain who'd never met Asian women and never talked to them, and but they identified on a class basis with being part of their struggle, and it changed people's attitudes on a massive level. And we should always remember that people change in struggle, and ideas change, and people are capable of great things when they're in struggle, and people can create, and our struggle creates amazing leaders, and it breaks down some of the chains of oppression and exploitation that we face.